the adopting of DEI as a fundamental value of the department in the same way that we think about clinical excellence and excellence in research, really wanting excellence in diversity, equity, and inclusion to be at the forefront so that the DEI leader can really be effective.
And I think leaders have a great opportunity to name these challenges publicly, provide explicit flexibility with how people are doing their work and say that that's okay, compensate work. And then I think really highlighting stories, especially women like us who have multiple other intersectional identities, and celebrate them, put them in leadership roles. This does reflect who we all are.
That's Dr. Ayana Jordan and Dr. Christina Mangurian, who will talk about their article on psychiatry diversity leadership in academic medicine. Their work appears in the March 2021 issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry. I'm Michael Roy, Executive Editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and this is AJP Audio. Dr. Ayana Jordan is an Associate Program Director of the Adult Psychiatry Training Program and an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine. She is a member of the APA Board of Trustees, and she serves on the Early Career Psychiatrist Advisory Committee for the journal Psychiatric Services. Her research is concentrated on increasing access to care for minoritized populations with substance use problems. Dr. Christina Mangurian is a professor of psychiatry, epidemiology, and biostatistics in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She is also Vice Chair for Diversity and Health Equity at the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and a former chair of the APA Council on Minority Mental Health and Health Disparities. Her primary research program focuses on promoting mental health equity for patients in the workforce. Dr. Jordan and Dr. Mangurian are co-authors of the clinical case conference in the March issue entitled Psychiatry Diversity Leadership in Academic Medicine, Guidelines for Success. Dr. Jordan, Dr. Mangurian, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Michael. Glad to be here.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Now, you are both leaders at your respective institutions regarding issues that affect women and minority populations in professional settings and in the community. I'd first like to learn more about how you came into these roles. Could you tell us about your background and how you became involved in your work?
So I have always been committed to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think another role that is often not talked about that really led to my further involvement in leadership is the concept of belonging. So as a Black woman who really sees myself as part of the academy and wanting to further ideas within academia, it was really hard for me to feel like I belong, that my point of view was actually valued, that people were listening to what I had to say, and more importantly, that I felt supported by my colleagues. And so I really wanted to have a space where we could have conversations about how to promote these issues and how to really allow people to bring their authentic selves, a different point of view that is not necessarily one that is often seen in academia. And, there was no outlet at our university at the time. And so a lot of the, platform really came after, unfortunately, there was a very public display of sexual harassment at Yale that made it to the New York Times. And we had a town hall forum. And I was very vocal in the town hall in terms of, yes, this is terrible, but this is not uncommon, unfortunately. And what we should not be surprised by this behavior, but more importantly, how can we create scaffolding that one is aimed at preventing this behavior from occurring, but also elevates minoritized identities. And when I say minoritized, those identities that are made to feel less than, right? Because oftentimes women may not be in the minority per se, although in academic leadership they are. Black and Latinx people may not be in the minority per se in the world, although they're made to feel in this country less than, right? So how do we create scaffolding to elevate minoritized identities to have more visibility and power in terms of what happens and what are the priorities for the department? So going back to that town hall, I was very, very vocal. My chair was present. And from there came a diversity task force. And we had a lot of success in terms of metrics with the diversity task force, which changed into a diversity committee. But it really came out of necessity in terms of who I am, the multiple identities that I hold, and not really having a space to be my authentic self and not seeing many others that would welcome me into that space.
Yeah, and just like Dr. Jordan, I'd say I've always been really passionate about health equity. In fact, I was raised to be in many ways. Both of my parents spent their careers trying to improve lives of vulnerable populations, both locally in the US, but also in Latin America. My mother's an immigrant from Ecuador. And just as Dr. Jordan kind of alluded to, as a Latina woman myself, I've had my fair share of experiences of microaggressions and discriminations throughout my life personally or towards my family members. And that's fueled my interest in this area. Then later, as I became a psychiatrist and a mother and an informal caregiver of a very seriously ill family members, I saw ways the academy could just do better, just do better to support people like us. And I ended up becoming the director of diversity eventually within my department. And then my chair, Dr. Matt State, took an incredible leadership decision, frankly, and decided to elevate this role to the vice chair for diversity. And that's extremely important because it means that I'm at the same footing as the vice chair for education, vice chair for research, vice chairs for clinical services, and serve on the executive committee.
So we've got you to the role you're in now. There's been a lot of change in the past few years around issues of equity throughout community and business life. A few years ago, the Me Too and Time's Up movements highlighted issues of gender discrimination and sexual harassment. And we've learned how these issues can affect salary, career advancement, and power dynamics in the workplace. And then last year, we all witnessed the widespread protests against racism and social injustice. How have your roles in your workplace and in your community changed over the course of the past few years?
Thanks so much. I'd like to just use this opportunity to provide a different perspective in terms of what's been going on. I think it really comes from a place of privilege that people are able to recently come to the larger, widespread issues related to sexual discrimination, racism, and I agree. There has been an awakening like no other in this country through really violent terms. I always say St. George Floyd and seeing just the devastation. But I love a quote that I saw on Facebook, and I don't know who to credit the quote to, but it says, "The same alarm has been ringing since 1619. You all have kept hitting snooze." So this is really important in terms of those of us who have been affected by this our entire careers, right? That we haven't had the luxury to just now get into the game in terms of the psychological distress that can really come. Yes, of course, the Me Too movement is important. Yes, of course, this newfound attention on terms of the ills of racism is important. However, I think I have to offer a different frame because that has been the space that I have lived all of my life as an adult woman dealing with sexual discrimination. It hasn't been uncommon. There's times that has happened without the Me Too movement, dealing with overt and covert racism, like Dr. Mangurian intimated. So it's been really painful. And I say that because I'm very happy that we're even here and even having this platform through AJP to talk about it. But I also want to just have the reality of how painful it is for really majority white America to just get hip to it, right? And so, what do? How has my role changed? Is the question that was asked. I have a lot more responsibility because there are not a lot of women who look like me in leadership. So that's great because I am able to have influence in terms of how the department should lead, what types of policies are in place, how we think about promotion. Now we have the inclusion of a diversity statement that has to be updated for any faculty member that wants to go up for tenure in our department. We now have an anti-racism task force. These are all programs that did not exist, right? And I've had the opportunity to really help advance these programs. Also, with the psychological distress of the pandemic, I've been called upon to lead processing groups for people who are on the front line. So lots of different opportunities for leadership. But again, what is the flip side of that? Who is there to care for the caretaker who has been experiencing the psychological weight of racism and sexism without much support? So I just love that this journal is taking the time to really dissect these issues because it allows us to reflect in terms of our own identities and ways in which we can support, really support, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit more, women in leadership who are called upon to do more, oftentimes with less.
Yeah, I just agree so much with everything that Dr. Jordan has said, and to pick up on it, I think I'll echo part of that, which is that most women and historically marginalized people are bearing a huge amount of the weight of work, a lot of academic housework that's often unpaid during the pandemic, and then simultaneously have a lot of extreme stressors at home. To get back to the question that you'd asked, my work has evolved naturally over the year, over the past few years. And I think, like Dr. Jordan so sagely expressed, it's just been able to be amplified more because of different cultural events, right? And so been given kind of the opportunity when these events happened. It's always been there all along. I think the major turning point for me professionally was actually in November 2016, when, regardless of your political affiliation, we all witnessed a highly qualified woman who lost an election to a man with really little experience for the job that he was pursuing. And that was painful for a lot of women who experienced that because they experienced that at work. And actually what made me become a member of Time's Up, a founding member for Time's Up Healthcare. And I just feel like I feel very fortunate that because of these events, I've been able to have a voice in being able to shape some of the policies and procedures in my institution and regionally in the US because of these cultural events that have occurred.
Thank you both for sharing, particularly since much of it is painful to continuously recollect. I'd like to turn to your article in the journal. It presents a case vignette of Dr. A Black female researcher and clinician educator who is affiliated with the Department of Psychiatry at an academic institution. A few years ago, she was appointed chair of the DEI committee, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And more recently, in the wake of the high-profile deaths of Black people at the hands of police, the chair of the department asked her to develop, quote, anti-racist programming. Could you tell us what happened next?
Yeah, this is such a great question, Michael. I'll let Dr. Jordan describe it a little bit more, but I want to just say, this is actually a shared composite case. Dr. A isn't just one woman, psychiatrist, diversity leader who went through this. Dr. A shares characteristics that many of us have and experiences that many of us had. And we brought together into Dr. A an experience of what was happening to her after George Floyd's death and the need for her academic setting to kind of respond.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Mangurian. I think that that's really important in terms of just reinforcing that it's a collective, unfortunately, composite of many different experiences of women in leadership. And so I don't want to be coy, but part of what happens next, and I'll tell you what happens next in the paper, but what I'd like the audience to really think about is what does happen next? What is the fate of Dr. A and your particular university, and how can you support efforts so that the work continues and is not mitigated or minimized with the resources that she's given? Unfortunately, in our case, which is not uncommon, Dr. A was encouraged to write a very strong email in response to what we've been seeing in the popular press, really no tolerance, anti-racism strategy for the department. And she had hoped that this strong stance would be sent out by the executive leadership. It wasn't. It was sent out on behalf of Dr. A. And in response, she got a lot of negative emails, backlash. Not to be dismayed, Dr. A kind of really continued the work and tried to be collaborative, but a lot of well-meaning colleagues decided to organize and do their own thing, which unfortunately made it look like Dr. A wasn't very effective in her role. And really feeling overwhelmed by the negative press that she received, the pop-up kind of protests that were happening that were not coordinated with her office, she asked for some more financial and administrative support from her chair and was met with, we don't have enough money because of COVID. And was basically told to continue the work the best that she can. So I'll stop there because this is the reality in many different academic institutions. We represent 7 of the top 10 psychiatry departments according to the 2020 U.S. News and World Report rankings. And this was not a shocking end to Dr. A's fate. And I will go out on a limb and say, beyond our psychiatry departments, this is happening throughout academia. And so the challenge of our article, and really the main purpose, is to really ask those in the academy that have power, how can we support Dr. A's efforts if we truly want to work towards a more inclusive, diverse environment? What is it going to take? What is the policy that's necessary? What is the makeup of the leadership? How can we challenge our existing systems to advance Dr. A's efforts so that she doesn't understandably leave academia?
Well, as Dr. Jordan indicates, the article outlines the fact that Dr. A's case is not unique. And you write that many academic programs are re-examining their DEI efforts, but that these efforts usually lack resources, such as funding and administrative support. What's the overall landscape like for diversity leaders at psychiatry departments?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, so much for this, and great question. And it's actually a large reason why I was interested in putting out our piece, to describe a little bit about the data that we had in our small sample, right? And so for readers to know, among our, again, very small sample, it may not surprise you, 100% are women, about 90% are Black or Indigenous or other people of color. The mean age is about 46, so a lot of them are in the sandwich era where they may be taking care of children and elderly parents. Almost 80% are moms. Close to half are caring for ill family members. More than half are primary breadwinners or providing money to others in their family. They were people who had a range in their rank within the university. So some were professors like me, some were assistant professors earlier in their career, like Dr. Jordan. But only half actually sat on executive committees, and 44% were receiving no compensation at all for their work. For those that did have compensation, it was lower than their reported effort. It wasn't commensurate with their effort. And about half had some discretionary funds, some money to use. It ranged widely from as low as 2,000 to as high as 100,000, but only a few were renewed annually. So some will hoard the funds that they're having for efforts and try to wisely about this.
I just want to really shout out Dr. Mangurian right now, because she not only is really responsible for the group of people that convened that really led to this article, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about it later, but was very insistent on including the data in terms of the current landscape, right? And wow, I must say, very little things amaze me, but I was really impressed by, not in a good way, the amount of work that we're being asked to do with such little resource. And I don't just mean financial resources, although that's important, but in terms of even title and status. And if we're not at the executive level, what does that mean in terms of creating procedures and policy? What does that mean in terms of being seen as a real change agent within a department, right? And all of the different intersecting identities, the obvious ones, race and gender, but like Dr. Mangurian said, caretaking. What does that mean in terms of really needing support, not just for children, but also for elder care? And, these roles traditionally fall. And so when we're thinking about the state of DEI leadership, we have to be all encompassing and realize the multiple responsibilities that people in these roles have. And so really to take heed to what people are dealing with. And I think the article outlines that very nicely.
And so, as you say, there's a lot of work to do to help give diversity leaders more tools to do their jobs. Do you know if the situation you're describing in academic psychiatry is similar to the situation faced by leaders in other fields of medicine and academia?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. I don't know for sure. I haven't seen data like this, but anecdotally at UCSF, I know that I'm pretty confident it's a shared experience, right? Fortunately, I think it's improving, and some departments have taken even stronger leadership roles to really give the funding and support that's necessary. But this is, I believe, I would bet that this is happening elsewhere in medicine, and I hope that others repeat our kind of small sample size, potentially with a larger sample size, and really look at it nationally, because I think that's what's necessary.
Exactly right. One of the things that helps me to maintain my sanity within academia and really channel my frustration is academic Twitter and med Twitter. So those are kind of hashtags that you can follow. Another popular one is Black in the Ivory. The point is that what we have highlighted in our article is shared amongst many different disciplines. And if you just see the accounts of surgeons and internists and ER docs, all across the spectrum, these instances, the state of the nation, as it were say, the state of academia is one that has definitely been echoed. I will say, similar to what Dr. Mangurian already stated, we have to see the data, right? So that just turns of what are the gaps that are missing. And I think until we formally assess it, which is a start of what our article calls for, let's see what's happening across subspecialties all over our nation.
Now, as Dr. Mangurian first stated in terms of samples out of the authors of this article, the article itself states that DEI leadership roles are often held by women or Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC individuals. And you point out 3 challenges that people in these roles confront. First, leadership barriers and a lack of representation. Second, the minority tax. And third, family obligations. Now, you've touched upon this in our conversation so far, but could you go over how each of these hurdles presents its own unique challenges?
Yeah, it's interesting because how I see it is that these are all really quite interrelated. and they do present unique challenges. I'm particularly interested in being very intentional for institutions to sponsor historically excluded individuals in leadership roles in academic psychiatry. I think this is what we have an opportunity to do, and that there's evidence to do this. We need to pay them for their roles, and having diverse leaders at the helm in the executive committee will create a culture change that realizes that family obligations, as you said, kind of this issue with family obligations, they're not bad for our work. They actually fill our employees with joy. And I guess most of the time, sometimes not, right? But most of the time. And these should be celebrated and encouraged. And so I think the lack of the first one that you mentioned, the lack of representation, leads to the minority tax and an underappreciation of family obligations. And so I think all of it really relies on diversifying the leadership team. You'll get just better outcomes. It's been shown in studies over and over again.
Absolutely. And the point that Dr. Mangurian is highlighting is the interconnectedness. And so we can't have these false divisions because one begets the other, and really thinking about and holistic approaches to solutions, right, to mitigate what we're seeing and really support varied representation. It has to be a way to strategically address all at once, as opposed to one by one by one. And so there's some really interesting work being done now. We didn't discuss it in the article, but I think that might be part 2, so stay tuned. But really thinking about the roles of cluster hires. You know, Dr. Mangurian talked a little bit about being very intentional to pay diversity leaders for their time and effort. And I also think there has to be a discussion on term limits in terms of how long do people in leadership get to stay, so that we're not seeing, you know, a historically white male in these positions for 12 and 15 and 16 years, to allow for diversity of thought, expression, but also a modeling of what is a leader. Can a leader bring their children to work? Can a leader change the schedule so that there is an opportunity to care for different members, and that it doesn't have to be a 9 to 5 always? I mean, this is the type of innovation that has been modeled in Fortune 500 companies that academia has to keep up with. So I'm excited. I'm cautiously optimistic about what's to come, but academia has to get on board.
And I will add to what Dr. Jordan said. I had the pleasure to work with the incredible Dr. Rajma Jagzi, who is a just phenomenal scientist and champion for gender equity. And she and I wrote a piece in the New England Journal about term limits, because it shows that if we continue as we're doing it right now, the forecast is that it would be another 50 years to reach gender parity in the top leadership in academic medicine. And that's too long.
So what are some initial steps that can help leaders in DEI positions? Your article recounts an anecdote that a small group of DEI leaders met at a recent APA annual meeting, and that this group has come to provide peer support and mentorship.
Yeah, I was alluding to this earlier, but thank goodness for mentors and the power of representation, because Dr. Mangurian didn't even know that she was a mentor before she officially became a mentor. And so what does that mean? It means that there has to be support, and in a very intentional way. Because of the minoritized identity in which she held, Dr. Mangurian saw a need and created a solution. And that was bringing these diversity leaders together. And thankfully at the time, Dr. Arthur Stewart said, use my presidential suite for this gathering. And so what a wonderful time we had in terms of just having access to, one, a beautiful space, because that's just a privilege to be able to get together in academia and be surrounded by beauty. So that was important. But also to have a concentration in terms of the pain of being in these positions without understanding of the path forward. And how can we change the destiny? And how can we do that with rigor and purpose? And so that really was the start of what we call the fierce leaders. And I'm going to try and get the acronym so you know what that means, because that came about from this group as well. And one of the things that we were able to do from this gathering is have monthly meetings where part of it we just spent in community. How are you, Ruth Shim? How are you, Helena Hansen? How are you, Erica? So many amazing women that we just pour into one another. We understand the oppression that can happen in these spaces. And so part of it is just to say, I see you, you are seen, you are valued, right? So that's one, support and representation. But then the other that really led to this article is, what is the scholarship necessary so that the next generation, and 50 years is way too long, does not have to go through some of the same experiences that we are? What is the way in which we're able to produce material and provide data so that the community will understand, the academic community? And so we have a whole plan of scholarship that we're going to get out there. And so that's amazing. And you'll see in the article. So you have to read the article, guys. Read the article to see all of the ways in which we've outlined a roadmap to the areas that need to really have more deliberate resources and efforts. I can't go into it because I want you to read it, but we do talk about obviously structural changes, the importance of something like an endowed chair, having a vice or associate chair title, financial support, needing those discretionary funds, needing salary support that Dr. Mangurian talked about, really being very clear about the role. What is it that we're called to do? I can't solve the ills of gender and racial discrimination that's been happening in our country for hundreds of years. So what is the specific task and ways that we can measure that? What are the metrics, right? So lots of different ideas that we put out that are really couched in the literature. So these are not things that we're just pulling from the air, right? They're grounded in the literature in ways that help to advance the mission. And so my fantasy is that this is going to be the seminal paper that chairs use. John Crystal, my chair, is going to say, oh my God, thank you so much, Dr. Jordan, for publishing this. This is what we're going to use as a way to start cultural change. So I'm excited, and I encourage, if you just read the case and then go down to the table, I'll be happy. But really check it out.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Dr. Jordan said. I'm just so deeply thankful to Alpha Stewart. She was our first Black president. She's a woman. She gave us this space, and it was just so lovely to have just not just a beautiful space, but her warmth and caring for all of us. And I remember that day, Ayana, when looking around the room, seeing familiar faces, but also just familiar experiences. It was really helpful. There were people where a lot of emotions. There was some crying, some tears of laughter, but relief of having each other, but a real determination to make things better for the future. And I just want to say Ayana has done a fantastic job leading this space now and really making sure people have a opportunity to feel safe. And another kind of an aside is that we have an email kind of string, a group, and we unintentionally, I think, provide each other with a lot of micro affirmations, which are necessary given how many microaggressions we receive.
You and your co-authors also write in the article that you have thrived in academia, not despite, but because you are BIPOC women, mothers, informal caregivers, and breadwinners. You add that little attention is placed on the experience of women in leadership roles. What can people with institutional power do to make sure that these experiences are not ignored?
We've touched upon a lot of it already, but really just providing the space to allow folks to be their authentic selves and bring all of their multiple identities to their leadership roles, and really figuring out as leaders within the department, how can we support people who wear many hats to excel in the academy and not limit them to, one part of their identity. How can they bring all of these roles so that others can thrive? Because the reality, and I think we're seeing that, the pandemic has really brought that to the forefront. The reality is that we're all juggling so much, and the ways in which academia can really be stifling and allowing folks to thrive in their jobs. And so what are the ways that we can promote what seems like things that are not as positive, people having children, people taking care of others? What are the ways that we can really support women in these roles so that they can be their authentic selves? I think is important. And realizing, because they've been able to have the skills to multitask, this is how they thrive. They're able to do many things at the same time and be effective with time management. And one of the things I say, can you imagine if you had support on top of what you're already doing, how the mission of the Academy can really be supported and grow?
Yeah, and I'll just say that I agree with everything that Ayana said, and I think leaders have a great opportunity to name these challenges publicly, especially now during COVID, provide explicit flexibility with how people are doing their work and say that that's okay, compensate work. And then I think really highlighting stories, especially women like us who have multiple other intersectional identities, and celebrate them, put them in leadership roles. This does reflect who we all are.
Now, you conclude your article by noting that DEI efforts should not be isolated from the power structures of a department. To this end, you provide a set of best practices to effectively support DEI leadership efforts in psychiatry. Now, we focused on some of them already, but could you take us through your overall recommendations?
First, really structural changes to recognize the commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So having that title, being a part of the leadership team. And again, not just for having a title for title's sake, but that really elevates the role in the broader department, medical school, but also within the academic home, right? So having the title, but not without support. So yes, a vice or associate chair is important, but are they a part of the leadership team? Can they make decisions at the departmental, cabinet, or executive committee level? Having an endowed chair that affords them not only the academic prestige, but also the support, right? The financial support necessary in order to be effective in that role. Salary support, that's the next big category. Financial support, salary support that actually reflects the effort, whether it be from 20 to 100%, reflective of the effort that the DEI leader is spending on the role. Discretionary funds and staff. We talked about being able to thrive because of all the different roles. If we were able to have admin support to allow us to really focus on the intellectual parts of the job and not an ministerial task, that would be even better. We talked a little bit about this, but really honing in into the role. What are the specific responsibilities that the DEI leader must perform? How is that going to be measured? What are those metrics, right? The reporting structure. Who does the leader report to? The dean, the department, both? That has to be really salient. We go into other parts of the role. Diversity committee. How do we select leaders within the department? What are some ways that the DEI leadership can have access to professional evaluation, professional development? This is all important. And then we stop with some overall considerations, right? And I love this in terms of inclusive excellence has to be at the very central mission, but really the adopting of DEI as a fundamental value of the department in the same way that we think about clinical excellence and excellence in research, really wanting excellence in diversity, equity, and inclusion to be at the forefront so that the DEI leader can really be effective. And so, listen, we've given you some recommendations. Now, the question that we pose is, what are you going to do about this? Don't let this just be an article within a very prestigious journal, and we're very excited about it, but let this be a tool towards action. And that's really what we're calling for. And we've tried to do the work to make it very tangible. Michael, we're excited. I hope you can sense that. We hope that people will get to moving.
Yeah, and I will just add to that. I am excited too, and I was very much of a stickler for this table, because
yes,
Ayana knows through multiple versions, and so I wanted the data and I wanted the table, and because one of my mentors, Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, is just an incredible physician scientist here at UCSF and vice dean for health equity and population health, she said scientists provide the rocks for advocates to throw. So this is a nice rock. This has a lot of very explicit pieces of information that either an advocate who's a chair who wants to advocate with his dean or her dean to get more resources, or it's a faculty member who's holding this role, they can say, these are recommendations that are made. This is some data that we know, and this information hopefully can guide some of our decisions.
Well, Dr. Jordan, I will stop before my next question and once again let you know that, yeah, we share your excitement for this article. We definitely are excited for it to come out in the March issue for the podcast episode. I'm expecting usage and podcast listeners to set records, but no pressure on the audience there. In our September 2020 issue, the editors of the American Journal of Psychiatry published a statement committing to combat racism, social injustice, and healthcare inequities. And many journals have published similar statements and seem to be more deliberate about publishing papers related to racism and social justice. One of the goals at AJP is to give priority to papers that examine matters born out of racism and inequities. How should scholarly research adapt to help advance these efforts?
Yeah, this is, again, a great question. And I guess I'd turn it back to the journal a little bit, because with the question here, I'm not really sure the research needs to adapt, the scholarly researchers. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be an adaptation at the level of the reviewers and the editorial teams. Okay. What's very clear through study after study after study is evidence has shown that reviewers of academic publications and in NIH for grants have implicit biases based on gender, race, ethnicity, and even types of science. Okay,
yeah.
So somebody like me or Ayana, who are both health services researchers who tend to do work with underserved populations, those are less funded by NIH, literally just because of the words that we use in our title. And it's not looked at as important. That's a problem. And so what I think I would love to see is, and I think, AJP is taking huge leadership roles in this area, is making sure the reviewers and the editorial boards are really receive trainings around DEI issues and implicit biases and learn about the different types of science that BIPOC investigators put out, and to value that these types of scholarly activities are important.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing much I have to add. That I just would like to underscore a call to do better in terms of the makeup. I mean, there's just no way we're going to move the needle, which again, it goes back to the point of 50 years being too long and really having to be very strategic about term limits and ways in which we're going to diversify. Because if we don't have a more diverse, and I mean that in every sense, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of race, gender, all of these things, even perspective, then we're going to continue to do the same thing and it's not working, right? And so we can't just turn a blind eye and say, well, why are these particular topics not being funded? It's not that the research is not being done, it's that it's not being supported. It's not being supported because the committees that make decisions on terms of what gets funded are not inclusive and not diverse. And so we have to put our attentions more upstream as opposed to looking at the downstream kind of outcomes of, I would even say, structural racism really at its core. And journals are starting, I think, definitely AJP is being very deliberate about looking at who is on the editorial team, who actually has the expertise. And if we don't have the expertise, we need to send it out to get it. And maybe that person is not an editor, but we got to figure it out, right? And just be very unapologetic about that. But again, that requires people to do things differently. And I hope the Academy is willing to do that.
Well, you expressed cautious optimism earlier, and I want to conclude with a question of overall, are you optimistic that we can overcome barriers and make real progress in efforts to expand diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout our community and workplace?
I am. I'm a living testimony to that. If I wasn't, I would have hung up my hat a long time ago. You know, it's not lost on me that I have recently become part of the less than 2% of NIH-funded independent R01 investigators that are Black. That's really important, not just as a feather in my cap, but to really be committed to increasing that number and being very deliberate about calling upon the systems that are responsible for that less than 2% to say, okay, what are we going to do? Because this is not going to continue in the same way. And being very strategic about that. I think just the existence of our group that allowed this scholarship to happen and take place is a testament in terms of how can we do things differently. Seeing articles like this published, having the makeup of editorial teams change. I mean, these are all of the things that signal that we're moving in the right direction. Yeah, we still have lots of work to do, but we're no longer asking for permission. We are setting the standard for what needs to happen and then saying, how can the Academy get on board, right? And so I am optimistic, but I realize that in order for this vision to be fully realized, that there has to be people in power, right, that don't look like me to get on board and to support these efforts. So we need white men and white women and people who are very privileged to support, even if they don't viscerally understand, but support for the sake of science, right? I want to give Dr. Mangurian a chance to respond to this, but I did find what FIERCE stands for. And so I want to have an opportunity because I think that it just allows us to end on a very positive note. Yeah.
Great. I guess I'll just say while we're waiting for that, Michael, to answer your question, I'm very optimistic. And as Ayana said, I know and expect that work will need to be done long after I'm gone. I think what's wonderful is that Ayana and I stand on the shoulders of so many great psychiatrists and diversity leaders who came before us. And we're equally fortunate to be able to lift up and mentor others who are creative future BIPOC leaders who will stand on our shoulders and continue to do the hard work that's needed to move our climate to be more truly diverse, inclusive, and equitable.
Well, then thank you both. And then Dr. Jordan, I'll give the floor back to you. You can give us the acronym.
This is the acronym: phenomenal, humble, intellectual, empowered, receptive, charming, exceptional women of American psychiatry. We are indeed the fierce women. Check us out. Look at the article. Look at our tweets. Listen to the podcast, because we are really committed to changing the future of academic medicine and we're excited for sure.
As are we. Dr. Ayana Jordan and Dr. Christina Mangurian, co-authors of a clinical case conference article in our March issue on psychiatry, diversity leadership, and academic medicine. Thank you both for speaking with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
This concludes this episode of AJP Audio. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to it. Please also visit our website, ajp.psychiatryonline.org, to check out trending articles, find CME courses, and watch videos highlighting some of our other articles. APA Publishing has other podcasts you can listen to. Psychiatry Unbound is the books podcast from APA Publishing. It's hosted by Dr. Laura Roberts, editor-in-chief of APA Books. Also check out From Pages to Practice, which reviews the latest research published in the journal Psychiatric Services. It's hosted by Dr. Lisa Dixon, editor-in-chief of the journal, along with Dr. Josh Beresin. You can subscribe to these podcasts on Apple, Google, Spotify, or on any of the popular platforms. Next month in AJP Audio, we'll talk with Dr. Karen Bierman of Penn State University about her work on the effect of a preschool intervention on later symptoms of psychopathology. We hope you'll join us too. Thank you for listening.